This video is the first of a two-part series on writing an academic essay. The topic of this first part is getting the most out of primary sources. So first we need to talk about what primary sources are, and secondary sources too while we're at it. A primary source is the material that you're writing about. In a sociology class, for example, you might write about an ethnographic study of Tarahumara Indian rituals, or in a history class, you might write about the abolitionist speeches of Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. In an English class like this one, a work of literature, As I Lay Dying, for example, is a common kind of primary source. Secondary sources are materials written about your primary source. An article written by a historian about Elijah Parrish Lovejoy would be a secondary source for the student writing about Lovejoy's speeches. For students writing about a novel like As I Lay Dying, articles written about Faulkner or the novel would be secondary sources. Sometimes how source materials are used will determine whether they are primary or secondary. An article about Faulkner may be a secondary source for the student writing about As I Lay Dying. However, if the student is writing about the article, then the article itself becomes the primary source. It's what you're writing about that determines whether a source is primary or secondary. So getting the most out of primary sources. I'm going to talk about three things: reading, annotating, and discovery. Let's talk about each of these in a little more detail here. There are different ways of reading depending on your objectives as a reader. There is reading for content, which requires you to retain and recall information. And this is what most of us are used to. This is what we're trained to do almost from the first grade, reading for content. This kind of reading prepares you to take a quiz or write up a report, but it is not particularly useful for writing an academic essay. When you're writing for an academic audience, you become a knowledge producer rather than a knowledge consumer, which requires a deeper engagement with your primary sources, which is what we'll be talking about for the rest of this video. Rather than reading for content, another strategy is reading to discover. So pay attention to how your sources shape your thinking as you read. What catches your interest? What puzzles you? What do you like or dislike? What would you like to know more about? These are not the kinds of things that you're going to be tested over, of course, like when you're reading for content, but this kind of thinking is what leads you towards academic writing. Reading to discover. So as part of that process of reading to discover, talk about annotation, it is much easier to remember details from the material you're reading than it is to keep track of your thoughts and revisit them again later. This is why it is important to write down your ideas as they occur to you during the reading process. You can record your thoughts in a notebook or on index cards. Some students find it easier just to pencil their ideas in the margins of the text. Be sure to mark the word, sentence, or passage that inspired your thought or your idea, as you may end up using it later when you write your essay. And I'll give you some examples of this in a moment. Finally, let's talk about discovery. Remember, the goal of an academic essay is to make discoveries. You're not describing, you're not reporting. That's what we do in primary school, writing book reports and so forth. Most of the time, when you're writing an academic essay, you may assume that your audience has already read the same primary sources that you have. Your goal, therefore, should be to say something new, to bring something up from below the surface of the text. So rather than stating the obvious, what your audience already knows, you should put forward claims that require evidence to be persuasive. That evidence will come from your primary sources for sure, but it could also come in the form of additional support from secondary sources, which we will talk about in part 2 of this video series. I'm going to give you a couple of pages from my copy of As I Lay Dying. So something that caught my attention early in the story was the big fish caught by Vardaman, who's the youngest of the Bundren sons. He shows it off. He shows off the fish to his father Ance and the neighbor Vernon Toll. And the first time you read this book, this incident may not have seemed particularly important, but as you read on, the fish keeps coming up in later chapters. So clearly, Faulkner wants the reader to consider the significance of the fish. And so I started marking and annotating the passages where the fish is mentioned. And just these are my actual annotations, and I wasn't thinking about making a video when I wrote these down. It's just a purely candid snapshot of my annotations. So this passage that you see here is from Vardaman's interior monologue after Addie dies. His thinking in this section is grief-addled. It's really hard to follow. And my annotations read, Mom and Fish confused. And what is the connection between the mom and the fish? So by this point, I started thinking there must be some kind of meaningful connection building between Addie and the fish. Both of them are dead, obviously, but I wasn't yet sure what to make of it. And then I got to page 84. So this is the shortest, most mysterious chapter in the book. It simply reads, My mother is a fish. This time, my annotations are in the form of questions. And again, this wasn't something that I premeditated. It's just something I noticed after going back and looking at them. So I'll just read these annotations since my handwriting is kind of hard to read there. Obviously important, but why a fish? Fish equals Christianity? Question mark. Why does he connect her with dead fish? And what does it mean? Symbol? So what do we do with our annotations then? Once I've finished reading and annotating, it is time to look back at my notes and develop them into research questions and topics. Remember, the aim of academic writing is to produce knowledge, to discover something new. So your questions should probe beneath the surface of the text. The best kinds of questions are questions that have more than one answer, or questions that lead to more questions. And I'm going to give you some examples now. I'm going to put up some questions that I had and then talk about how I formed those questions into topics. So my first question is, what does Vardaman's fish symbolize? What other animals does Faulkner use as symbols? When I translate that into a topic, I said Faulkner's use of animals as symbols. Basically, when I'm converting the question to a topic, I'm translating it from a question to an idea or a statement. Here's my next set of questions. What does the act of catching and cleaning the fish mean to Vardaman? And that got me thinking about hunting and fishing and boyhood, and how for lots of certainly for boys at this time, and perhaps for boys and girls today, hunting and fishing is an initiation ritual. So I thought about a topic of hunting and fishing as boyhood initiation. What parallel does Vardaman see between the fish and his dead mother? And I turned that into the topic, the psychology of grief. As a conventional symbol for Jesus Christ, does Vardaman's fish have religious meaning? That's my question. And the topic I derived from that is Faulkner and religious belief. So I'm going to take these questions and topics now. I'm going to just slide them all together. And the next step then is to start looking at keywords, words that I can actually use when I start doing my research, start looking for secondary sources for articles about the novel. So some keywords from the first stack there, from what does Vardaman's fish symbolize? What other animals does Faulkner use as symbols? Faulkner's use of animals as symbols. Those two boxes there. I got this collection of keywords: Vardaman, fish, animals, and symbols. From the next set, I got manhood instead of boyhood, fishing, and initiation. I could have left it boyhood, but I changed it to manhood. Vardaman kind of sees himself becoming a man, I think, after killing the fish. From the next set, I get psychology, grief, and death. And from the last set, I get religion, Christianity, spirituality. So this is my list of keywords. I'm going to talk about how to organize these next. There are two keywords that I have not mentioned yet, and these should be included in your research. These would be the most important words. Do you know what they are? Faulkner and As I Lay Dying, of course. So I'm going to create a kind of heat map of key terms. I would say that these terms are the hottest: Faulkner and As I Lay Dying. I'm going to start with these terms for sure. I started thinking, what are some of the other terms here that I think are likely to give me lots of results? So I went with, on the right there, Vardaman. I thought psychology might give me a lot of results. On the left, manhood and religion. So I'm going to add those to my heat map. And then I've got some slightly cooler words. On the left, Christianity. On the right, symbols, fish, and grief. Put these words over. Basically, what I'm doing is creating a hierarchy of words. I'm going to start with the hottest search terms, and then as I get deeper into my search, I might add some of the cooler search terms. So the coolest of them would be the ones that are remaining there: initiation, fishing, spirituality, animals, and death. And those are very much kind of on the periphery of my heat map. And what I'm going to do now is create a list of search terms. That looks like this. So on the left, we have my I would say the hottest search terms: Faulkner, As I Lay Dying, Vardaman, psychology, religion, manhood. And then I've got my secondary search terms in the middle there, and then my tertiary search terms, the ones that I might not use at all the way over on the right. I'm just kind of keeping those in reserve in case I'm dissatisfied with my search results. So now I'm going to use these terms to look for secondary sources. I'm going to move my list. Let's pull up the Galileo page. You might review the video navigating the library and using databases before moving forward with this video, because I assume that you've already watched that video and you're familiar with Galileo and navigating databases. So I have my keywords here, and there's the search button, which I'll click as soon as I'm ready to search. Some other things I want to point out here is that you can use quotation marks to search for specific phrases. And you'll notice that I've got some words in all caps in there. Those are called Boolean operators. So you can combine search terms using operational words like and, or, and not. You write them in all capital letters, by the way. This is called a Boolean search. It just allows you to combine search terms to get more refined results. So some research tips. We'll just wrap up this first video with some research tips. Remember, different combinations of search terms will net different results. If you're not satisfied with the yield of your initial search, your terms may be either too narrow, so you didn't get enough results, or maybe your terms are too broad and you got way too many results. So, for example, using the phrase "as I lay dying" in combination with other terms may limit your results too much, just as using the phrase "as I lay dying" by itself would probably give you too many results to be useful. So try different combinations of search terms and Boolean operators until you find what you're looking for. I call this adjusting to the situation. The other tip I have is be patient with the process. Be patient with the process. Research requires time and patience. Do not expect to find quality secondary sources easily or quickly. You may spend an hour or two doing research. Sometimes it takes longer. If you do not give yourself enough time, you may become frustrated with the process. You will be rewarded for your resourcefulness and persistence. And that concludes part 1 of the video series, Writing an Academic Essay. The next video, we will talk about getting the most out of secondary sources. Hope you like the hearses in this video.